We had hosted a lovely book group a couple weeks ago at the Darien Nature Center for this book, Under a White Sky, and it was a very interesting, sobering, very talkative crowd. We were really happy. So we're so lucky to have the author come and present it to you this evening. Let me thank the Darien Library for bringing these programs to the public. This is all underwritten by the Friends of the Library, and we can't say enough to thank them for that. We'd also like to thank our friends and partners at Barrett Bookstores who have this book as well as Elizabeth's other books on their shelves. So if you want to stop by, they'll be open tomorrow morning, and I'm sure they have plenty for you to have. Also, at the end of the program, we'll be taking questions. So type your questions into the Q&A box. And let me tell you a little bit about Elizabeth before we begin our program. Elizabeth Kolbert is the author of Field Notes from a Catastrophe, Man, Nature, and the Climate Change, and The Sixth Extinction, a Pulitzer Prize winning international bestseller. The Sixth Extinction shook readers to their core and quickly became one of the most acclaimed books of the 21st century. Kolbert is a staff writer for The New Yorker and an important literary educator on the environment. She lives not too far from us in Williamstown, Massachusetts, with her husband and her children, and we are so happy to have her. And sit back, enjoy, pour yourself a cup of tea, and get ready to learn some very interesting facts.
I want to begin tonight. I've titled things The Control of Nature here, and I'm going to begin here at the University of Wyoming, just outside the University of Wyoming's Engineering Hall. So this building was constructed in the 1920s, actually with proceeds from oil that had been discovered right on campus. And as you can see, it's a very handsome building. It made use of local materials, local Wyoming sandstone. And 50 feet or so above the main entrance, there's a message carved in the stone, which we're going to get a close-up of now. And it says, "Strive on, the control of nature is one not given." Now, I don't know where this exhortation comes from or who thought it up, but I think I'll venture to say that at the time the building opened, most people found this inspirational. As I said, this was in the 1920s, and there was a great deal of faith in the future that humanity was creating for itself. The idea that nature could and should be harnessed for human ends. This was really at the heart of what it meant to be an engineer. To give you just one example, this is the wood screw pump, which was patented in 1920. It was not a pump made out of wood. It was a pump designed by a man named A. Baldwin Wood. And it was so effective. It's a huge pump. You can't really see that from this patent application, but it's huge. And these were such effective machines that they allowed the really soupy swamps around New Orleans to be drained. And this new land became new neighborhoods where now tens of thousands of people are living. And the New Orleans Item ran a piece also in 1920 celebrating this achievement. And I am quoting from it. Now it says, "Man is every day surpassing nature." So I borrowed the title from the inscription on Engineering Hall for a couple of reasons, one of which has to do with a pair of writers, a pair of my favorite writers, I should say, Rachel Carson and John McPhee. So in the late 1950s, Carson was at work on the book that would eventually become Silent Spring, and she wasn't sure what to call it. And so it had the working title. Before it became Silent Spring, it was called The Control of Nature. This was not, of course, the control of nature in the triumphalist sense that the engineers at the University of Wyoming had intended. It was the control of nature in a new and much darker key. So since the Engineering Hall had been completed, not only had much of the country been visibly transformed, it had also been invisibly transformed. Radioactive fallout while impossible to see, was showing up everywhere in the 50s, late 1950s, including in toddlers' teeth. This was the days of above ground nuclear testing. Synthetic pesticides, too, were ubiquitous. This was the subject of Carson's book, of course. These were designed to kill insect pests, but they also killed fish and beneficial insects and birds, and as Carson pointed out, not that infrequently humans. And so though the phrase, the control of nature, was dropped as the title for the book, Rachel Carson makes very poignant use of it in the closing pages of Silent Spring. And now I'm quoting from the last chapter of Silent Spring. The control of nature is a phrase conceived in arrogance, born of the Neanderthal age of biology and philosophy, when it was supposed that nature exists for the convenience of man. So a couple of years after Silent Spring came out, John McPhee, the great John McPhee, paid a visit to the University of Wyoming. And as he stood outside the engineering hall, he was struck by the inscription over the entrance. And he ended up borrowing the phrase, the control of nature, for the title of the wonderful book he published, The Control of Nature, in 1989. So McPhee, like Carson, had major doubts about the whole control of nature project. But whereas Carson's tone was worried and even could say anguished, McPhee was skeptical, even sort of bemused. At the center of The Control of Nature, for those who haven't read it or haven't read it recently, is a story about a volcanic eruption on the island of Heimaey, which is off the southern coast of Iceland. And the eruption, which occurred in 1973, destroyed half Vestmannaeyjar, which is really the only thing on this island, the only town on this island. And in an effort to save the other half, Icelanders began quite literally hosing down the volcano. So between February 6th and July 10th, 1973, they pumped approximately 8 million cubic yards of water onto the lava flows. And they convinced themselves that this is what had made all the difference, that this is what had saved the other half of the town. But as McPhee notes, the truth of this, and now I'm quoting again, the truth of this will never be known, the role of luck being unaccessible, the effects of intervention being ultimately incalculable, and the assertion that people can stop a volcano being hubris enough to provoke a new eruption. So since the publication of The Control of Nature in 1989, we've really entered, I think, a whole new phase in our understanding of nature and of control. In 2021, the issue is not so much that we're striving to control nature, either arrogantly, as Carson thought, or delusionally, as McPhee thought. It is that without even seeking to, we do control nature. I use that term advisedly. What I mean by controlling nature is that we dominate it. With every passing year, the border between the human and the natural becomes blurrier and blurrier. I keep a kind of running list of statistics here. They're on one level very impressive, and on another level totally terrifying. I'm just going to share a few of them with you. Humans have directly transformed more than half the ice-free land on Earth. This amounts to some 27 million square miles. We've done this by building cities and suburbs and reservoirs, and also by cutting down forests and planting monocultures. We've probably indirectly transformed about half of what remains by laying pipes and seismic lines and logging roads. Humans have dammed or diverted most of the world's major rivers. There are about 250 rivers on the planet that are 1,000 kilometers or longer. And a recent study published in the journal Nature found that only a quarter of these flow uninterrupted to the ocean, and that, quote, very long, free-flowing rivers are restricted to remote regions of the Arctic and of the Amazon and Congo basins. The same study found that there are nearly 3 million dams in the world, and another 3,700 hydropower dams are currently planned or under construction. I don't want to belabor this, but here are just a few more statistics. On an annual basis, we now emit at least 100 times more carbon dioxide than volcanoes do. We routinely cause earthquakes. This is mainly due to fracking and other forms of extraction, a particularly damaging human-induced earthquake that shook Pawnee, Oklahoma on the morning of September 3rd, 2016, was felt all the way in Des Moines. In terms of biomass, the numbers are really quite stunning. These are figures are from a paper that appeared a few years ago in the journal PNAS. And you can see that humans now outweigh all wild mammals by a factor of 9 to 1. And if you add in our livestock, our mammalian livestock, which is mostly cows and pigs, the ratio climbs to 24 to 1. So humans and our domesticated livestock outweigh wild mammals 24 to 1. Here's another way to look at things. Another pretty extraordinary figure. This is from a paper. This is from quite a recent paper from Nature again. What this graph is showing is that the weight of all human-made stuff, what's here called anthropogenic mass, the weight of all human-made stuff on Earth is now roughly equivalent to the weight of all the biomass on Earth. So all the living things, all the plants, all the animals, all the plankton, all the fungi. And the weight of human-made stuff is presumably only going to keep increasing. So those lines are soon going to cross, and human-made stuff will presumably weigh more than all of the Earth's biomass. And here's another figure that I think is really quite stunning from that same paper. Animal biomass on the planet totals about 4 gigatons, so 4 billion tons. That includes fish and mammals and insects. The mass of plastics on Earth is now twice that amount, around 8 gigatons. The accumulation, I'm quoting from this paper, the accumulation of anthropogenic mass has now reached 30 gigatons per year, the authors of the paper wrote. This corresponds to each person on the globe producing more than his or her body weight in anthropogenic mass every week. So humans' impacts on the planet are now so significant that we've had to come up with a new term for the current geological epoch, the Anthropocene. In the age of man, there's nowhere, and I really mean unfortunately nowhere, where you can go where you won't find evidence of human activity. So this is a photo that was taken from a Japanese submersible at the bottom of the Mariana Trench in the Western Pacific. As you probably know, that's the world's deepest trench. And this photo is taken at a depth of almost 36,000 feet. And what you are seeing there are bits of plastic. Now, one reaction to this, it's my own reaction, is that these are not good trend lines. I don't want to harp on plastics, but here's another statistic. If current trends continue, then by 2050, it's predicted there will be by weight more plastic waste in the ocean than fish. And that just does not seem sustainable. And a logical response is, well, let's change these trend lines. This is a response that many people I respect advocate. They say humans need to scale back. Let's stop converting forests into farmland. Let's stop burning fossil fuels, or at least burn a lot less. Let's stop making plastics or produce a lot less of it. And there's a very compelling case to be made for this response on environmental grounds and even on ethical grounds. But I myself am not an advocate. I'm a journalist, which is to say an observer. And so I don't really see my role so much in telling the world what we should be doing, where we should be going, but informing people, reporting on what we are doing, where we are headed. So please don't mistake anything I'm about to say as a recommendation for the future. It's just that I don't see a great deal of evidence that we're scaling back. or to put things more starkly, I don't see a lot of evidence that we have the will to scale back. And although COVID briefly interrupted some of these trend lines, all indications that we are already back to business as usual. Here's a few very recent headlines. Global rainforest destruction surge in 2020, carbon emissions to soar in 2021, global plastic production up, OPEC and IEA see bullish oil demand this year. So while scaling back is not just a good idea, probably not just a good idea, probably a very necessary idea, unfortunately the opposite seems to be happening. And this is the other reason I started off at the engineering hall in Laramie. It may seem quaint now, the message on the hall, but it's still very much the message we live by. Only now what we're striving to control is not a nature that exists or is imagined to exist apart from the human. Instead, the new effort begins with a planet remade and spirals back on itself. What we're attempting to control is a nature that we ourselves have helped bring into being. And that is really the subject of my latest book, Under a White Sky. So I'm just going to use the remaining time that I have this evening to tell you two quick stories from the book. The first begins in Chicago on the Chicago River. This is what the Chicago River looked like this past March on St. Patrick's Day. Every year on St. Patrick's Day, the river is dyed green, which I think is pretty telling of how people treat the river. It's a pretty amazing sight. So the city of Chicago grew up along the Chicago River. There are probably some Chicagoans here tonight. As you can see from this old map, it has two branches which come together and then flow, or at least used to flow, into Lake Michigan. And as the city expanded, the river was really key. All of Chicago's waste, its human waste, and also all of its animal waste from its tremendous stockyards, all of this was dumped into the river. And you can imagine the effects that that had. It was said that the Chicago River was so thick with filth that a chicken could walk from one side to the other without getting her feet wet. So as the city grew and grew, this became more and more of a problem, because I also should mention Chicago gets its drinking water from Lake Michigan. So there were constant outbreaks of waterborne disease, and it was decided that something had to be done about this. And what the city's leaders decided to do was to reverse the flow of the Chicago River. This entailed a massive construction project, perhaps the biggest construction project of its day, the creation of what's now known as the Sanitary and Ship Canal. Oh, sorry, that's the stockyards. This is some of the equipment that was brought in to build the Sanitary and Ship Canal. And when the canal was completed, instead of flowing east into Lake Michigan, the Chicago River flowed west, or really southwest, into the Des Plaines River, which flows into the Illinois River and on to the Mississippi. And when the Sanitary and Ship Canal opened, the New York Times ran a wonderfully snarky story about it. And the headline was, "Water in the Chicago River now resembles liquid," because finally you were getting rid of some of that waste and flushing it basically down the Mississippi. So these maps give you a sense of what the river system looked like before the canal was dug and then after. And those black rectangles there, those are locks that they have put on the lake to control the flow of water. So reversing the flow of the Chicago River solved one problem, but in the process, it created a new one. So before the canal existed, the Great Lakes constituted one drainage basin, and the Mississippi River system constituted another. And these were distinct. If you were an aquatic creature, you could not get from one to another. But the canal made it possible for Great Lakes species to swim or shimmy or into the Mississippi system and vice versa. And over the course of the 20th century, both systems became highly invaded once again, thanks, of course, to people. And one of the big sources of all these invaders was actually the St. Lawrence Seaway, which was constructed in the 1950s. So this is just a list. This is just showing you the latest tally of invasive species in the Great Lakes. That number continues to grow. They're sort of making a joke of it here, just crossing off one number after another. So 184 species established in the Great Lakes. And some of the most ecologically significant invaders, as you probably have heard, are this group of creatures known as Asian carp. So Asian carp, people sometimes think it's one species. It's really 4 distinct species, which you're seeing here. And each one was imported to the US purposefully in the 1960s, actually, as a form of control. The idea was that each of these fish would perform some useful function. So for example, grass carp eat weeds. And the idea was you'd bring them in and you could get rid of these aquatic weeds, many of which were also invasive species, and you wouldn't have to use herbicides. So this sort of biological control actually, ironically enough, gained a lot of currency thanks to Rachel Carson and Silent Spring. In the last chapter of Silent Spring, Carson recommends biological control as an alternative to chemicals, as an alternative to the Neanderthal control of nature. But that distinction, we now realize, is not as much of a distinction as Carson might have hoped. Biological control is still an effort at control, and it can still go terribly awry. And as you have guessed probably already, that's what happened here with the Asian carp. These fish very soon got out of control. They escaped from the sort of experimental ponds where they were being kept, and they basically just took over the Mississippi River system. In some parts of the system, Asian carp now make up more than 3/4 of the biomass. These fish are silver carp, which have the exciting but also rather terrifying tendency to jump when they're startled. And one of the things that startles them is the sound of a motor. So that's what you're seeing there, Asian carp jumping. So as Asian carp swam up toward Chicago and the Great Lakes, now it was decided by the folks in Chicago that something had to be done about this. And I shouldn't say just the folks in Chicago, all of the folks who live along the Great Lakes. No one wanted them to be invaded yet again by another species like silver carp. And so the Army Corps of Engineers was called in to add a new layer of control, one that could be superimposed on the old. And what the Corps came up with was a series of electric barriers. So if you travel down the Chicago River or up, or guess what's now down, what used to be up, and you ride down the Sanitarian Ship Canal, which I did one day, which was a very interesting trip, you will get to this sign eventually. And it is warning you, do not go into the water because you could be electrocuted. And the Corps is pulsing quite a lot of electricity through the water in the hope that the carp, which are quite big fish, almost human-sized fish, will experience a shock. There's a voltage difference. So as they nose into this area where their electricity is being pulsed into the water, they'll get a shock, and hopefully they will turn around and head back towards the Mississippi River. But no one is terribly confident that this is a fail-safe way to keep carp out of the Great Lakes. And so another barrier is planned now farther south. And this will feature not just electricity, but also noise and water jets. And it has a price tag, an anticipated price tag of about $1 billion. And right now it's in the design phase. The Corps is still looking for an appropriation for that, but I think it probably will go forward. So I offer the story of the Chicago River because it is, I think, an unusually clear illustration of the pattern we are now stuck in. The response to the problem of control gone awry is not to reject control, but to layer on new forms of control. So first you reverse a river and then you electrify it. We still believe, or at least we act as if we believe, that if engineering got us into a mess, then more engineering will get us out. So the second story that I'm going to tell before wrapping things up involves climate change, very much on everyone's mind this week as the latest round of climate negotiations wrap up in Glasgow. The stakes here are very high, much higher even than on the Chicago River. We are, quite possibly talking about the future of civilization. I don't think that's an exaggeration, but the pattern is essentially the same. So this is a project I visited about a year ago in Iceland. I managed to get there during COVID, which was interesting. And what you're seeing here, these machines that look like giant air conditioners are what's known as direct air capture units. And what happens is that they're sucking in air, just ordinary air. And inside of these machines are chemicals that absorb CO2. They just pull CO2 out of the ambient air. And then they cycle. The chemicals get heated up, the CO2 gets forced off and pumped away, and the process starts again. And once enough CO2 has been collected, it gets piped very deep underground, a mile deep, into Iceland's volcanic rock. And there, very deep underground, under a lot of pressure, a lot of heat, the CO2 reacts with the rock, and it forms the mineral calcium carbonate, which is basically chalk. And if you could peer underground, this is what it would look like. This is a core that they pulled up. It shows you that dark volcanic rock, and then you see that white, that little sort of seam of white. That is this vein of calcium carbonate that was formed by shoving CO2 underground. So what's the point of this? What's the point of building machines to suck CO2 out of the air? The awkward fact is that we have put so much carbon into the air already that if we want to keep temperatures from rising more than 2 degrees Celsius, we probably need to do more than just reduce our emissions. This graph shows you why. That purple wedge, that's the amount of CO2 that we're probably going to have to pull out of the air if we really are serious about preventing temperatures from rising more than 2 degrees C, even assuming that we get our act together and start to cut emissions very, very soon, global emissions. And that wedge is quite significant. It represents billions of tons of CO2 that will have to be somehow sucked out of the air and stored somewhere else. So carbon removal hasn't gotten a lot of attention yet, but I think it will. I can quite confidently predict that because just about anyone who looks seriously at the numbers reaches this conclusion that we're going to have to figure out a way to get carbon dioxide out of the air. So a lot of people are looking at how we could do this. This is an image from a website of a company called Charm Industrial. It's another take on carbon removal. Their idea is to take waste biomass, so stuff like sawdust and corn stalks, and heat it up and turn it into this kind of goop and pump it into old oil wells. So sort of oil pumping in reverse. Another group called the Future Forest Company wants to crush basalt into dust and spread it on the forest floor. This is sort of the reverse of what they're doing in Iceland, forcing the CO2 in the ground. Instead, here we bring the rock up and to meet the atmosphere. Heirloom, company called Running Tide wants to grow kelp, which will take up CO2 as it matures, and then they will sink the kelp to the bottom of the ocean so it won't rot and give up the CO2. Now, if your reaction to all this is, well, I'm not sure this is going to work, I'm not sure I want to bet the future of the planet on it, there's another engineering scheme to potentially fall back on, and this is perhaps the ultimate engineering scheme, and this is what's known as solar geoengineering. And this is a drawing of how solar geoengineering might proceed. We would engineer aircraft that could fly into the stratosphere, carrying a pretty heavy payload. And these aircrafts would spray some kind of reflective material up there in the stratosphere. It would be some kind of very fine particles that would drift around and create this sort of stratospheric haze, which would then reflect sunlight back to space. So actually less direct sunlight would hit the Earth, and that would have a cooling effect. And the reason that scientists think this could work is because that's what volcanoes do. They emit a lot of sulfur dioxide, which forms these little tiny droplets in the stratosphere that are very reflective. This is why after a major eruption, this is Mount Pinatubo going off in 1991, you get these fantastic sunsets, and you also get temporary global cooling. So the temperature is depressed until these particles fall out of the stratosphere, which takes about a year or so. But if you stage these sort of fake eruptions, if you sent this fleet of aircraft into the stratosphere, you could constantly replenish those particles and maintain the cooling effect. And the parallel with the Chicago River is, I hope, clear here. Once again, one form of intervention begets another. Having poured way too much CO2 into the atmosphere, we are now imagining ways of counteracting that by putting some kind of reflective material into the stratosphere. So solar geoengineering has been described as dangerous beyond belief, as a broad highway to hell, and as unimaginably drastic. The possible side effects are myriad. They include changes in regional weather patterns, damage to the ozone layer, and changes to the color of the sky. That is the source of the title of my book. The first experiments related to solar geoengineering were supposed to take place this past summer in northern Sweden. They were supposed to take place on a scientific balloon like this one. They were very, very small scale experiments that would not have affected the climate at all. But they were postponed because there was so much opposition to them on the ground in Sweden. And I myself sympathize with this opposition, but the opposition unfortunately does not address the underlying problem, which is that we have altered the atmosphere and hence the climate. So the question is the world better off with the climate we are right now engineering by burning many billions of by producing billions of tons of CO2 every year by burning fossil fuels? Or is it better off with a climate that's been altered in one direction by CO2 and then altered in the opposite direction with reflective particles in the stratosphere? And this is the question at the heart of my recent book, which I thought of titling The Control of Nature, but as I said, ended up calling Under a White Sky. And questions like these are at various scales going to keep presenting themselves. You may have read about the Army Corps of Engineers, proposal to put up a 6-mile long, 20-foot high seawall around Miami. There's a proposal to build an equally massive seawall to protect New York. There's a lot of opposition to both of these projects, and I don't know if either one will ever get built. I don't know if either of them should get built. But once again, these massive engineering projects have to be assessed against the alternative. Sea levels are rising, the rate of rise is accelerating. So in low-lying coastal cities like New York, doing nothing is likely to mean that whole neighborhoods will have to be abandoned. And that is obviously a very unattractive alternative. So as engineers, humans were already in the 1900, capable of reversing rivers. We've now sent probes to Saturn and mapped the human genome. Our talents have been extended in directions that earlier generations of scientists could hardly have imagined when they carved Strive On into the engineering hall in Laramie. With great power, it is said, comes great responsibility. Unfortunately, we haven't exercised much in the way of responsibility. We've acted as if there are no limits and as if new technologies will always come to our rescue. And I think that is unfortunately the question that confronts us today. I wish I had more confidence that they actually will rescue us. And with that, I am going to turn it over to questions from you all.
I have a question. How much research or thought is given to using other methods, such as keeping the rainforests intact, planting trees, and other ways that enhance the ecological services of nature? Or does that not have enough impact?
That's a good question. I mean, I do think a lot of people are, quote unquote, thinking about that. And there's a lot of talk about trying to use reforestation, planting trees as a way to draw down CO2 from the atmosphere. And there's absolutely, there's a lot of potential for using reforestation, as a counter to climate change, but you cannot draw out of the air. Forests take a long time to grow. They grow in real time. Meanwhile, we are digging up. When we burn fossil fuels, we're basically digging up forests from hundreds of millions of years ago and combusting them. Forests that didn't completely rot and give up their carbon, 300 million years ago, and putting it into the atmosphere. And you cannot counter that by growing forests in real time. The processes are just incommensurate. So I do think that there's a certain amount of exaggeration and there of how much impact reforestation could have also on a planet, to be honest, that continues to deforest. So not only are we not reforesting, we're actually continuing to deforest. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing a lot of work to reforest. We absolutely should, and that would be useful on many fronts, obviously on the habitat front as well. But it's not, there's no way to get through reforestation to where we need to go. We cannot, sort of suck up all of our carbon emissions. We still have to stop emitting carbon.
All right, we have another question. Do you think the Glasgow summit will produce valuable and lasting results?
That's another good question. I think it will produce, I think, to use a bad pun, the heat is on. Everyone realizes that in high places. There will be a lot of things pledged. There have already been a bunch of things pledged at Glasgow. The question really is whether those pledges will be lived up to. If everyone does what they've pledged to do at Glasgow, that is meaningful. It doesn't, once again, solve the problem, but it would be a meaningful step toward ameliorating the problem, or I should say, avoiding the worst outcomes. But we've seen, unfortunately, a lot of pledges made at previous negotiations that have unfortunately not been adhered to. And when the sort of rubber hits the road right now, for example, we're seeing high energy prices, and those, you could argue that's the best thing that could happen. We should have high prices for fossil fuels, but there will be a lot of political pressure to bring those prices down and to keep pumping fossil fuels into the system, because our globally economies depend on it. So that what's going to win out in the short, medium term, I don't know. I think in the long term, we will move away from fossil fuels, but what we're really racing against the clock here. So the question of what will happen over the next 10 years is key and remains to be seen.
Along with that question, someone asked, how will any agreement from Glasgow be monitored?
Oh, well, it could be monitored. I mean, there's all sorts of technology people have pointed out. We now have technologies where we could even sort of remotely measure emissions, maybe not incredibly precisely, but probably pretty accurately. So there are all sorts of ways to monitor it. But one of the big issues in Glasgow, which I guess will wrap up tomorrow night, or usually if it follows the usual pattern, sometime in the middle of the night, Friday into Saturday, will be this issue. If you will hear this word transparency. How are we going to monitor it? How are we going to ensure that countries actually are living up to their pledges? And the sad fact is, there's no, all of these agreements are voluntary. There's no enforcement mechanism. So the only weapon is sort of shaming countries, saying, well, you pledged this, but you didn't live up to it. And there's a lot of fuzzy math that goes into this. So, keeping track of emissions is key, absolutely key. And as I say, with satellite technology, it does get easier and easier to actually monitor other countries.
I have a question. What is the single best measure to reduce carbon emissions?
The single best measure, sort of globally, not on a personal level, globally. Well,
I think globally.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are basically three big chunks of emissions. There's power production. Okay, you plug something into the socket, the power is coming from right now, if you're in Connecticut, I don't know exactly what the energy mix is, but probably most of it's coming from natural gas, which is a fossil fuel. So that's one big chunk of emissions. And the other big chunk is transportation. This is why there's such a big push for electric cars, but that doesn't do that much good. Electric cars are much more efficient anyway than gasoline-powered cars, but if you're plugging them into this grid that we have now, so you need a grid that's been transformed so that it's not, we're not burning fossil fuels to produce electricity. We need a transportation system that doesn't rely on gasoline and diesel fuel. And we also need land use policies, and agriculture is the other big chunk of emissions. And those are the biggies. I guess I'd say, if you said the first thing, what should we be doing? We should be tackling our power production. How do we get power? And that's not easy. We're still getting something like 80% of our power in the US from fossil fuels.
Are efforts such as the Brooklyn Bridge Park creating man-made wetlands at all effective in protecting cities from flooding?
That's a really good question, and I'm gonna punt here. I don't have enough expertise to say. I think that they do provide sort of a buffer against storm surges, like we saw with Superstorm Sandy, but just against sea level rise, I'm not sure that they really are going to can really do much good. I mean, if the sea is rising, the sea is rising. So I think you might protect against certain storm surge damage, but I don't think you could really protect against simple sea level rise.
Yeah. Here's one about the electric car. Do you think the electric car revolution will make a real difference by 2030?
That's a really good question. I mean, if these pledges, California has said they're going to phase out, gasoline powered cars. And I think we'll have a very good idea in the next few years. I mean, if we see a big shift, then maybe by 2030, it will make a difference. I mean, it takes a long time for the car fleet to completely turn over. And as many people have, we're way far away from that, but we're certainly, I think some of the announcements by the big car makers, Ford saying they were not planning GM not planning to sell any internal combustion engines after 2040. That very significant if true. How's that?
That sounds interesting. Here's one about plant-based diets. Do you see moving towards a plant-based diet impactful for the atmosphere and the planet?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely is impactful. If everyone were eating a plant-based diet, it would have an impact. The big ways in which animal agriculture has climate impacts is, we're simply converting, a lot of the world, the Amazon rainforest is getting cut down to grow soy, let's say, and corn to feed, pigs and cows. So that's where we get this deforestation, and as I said, a lot of that's for animal feed. So that's one way in which animal agriculture really contributes to climate change. And the other way is, as everyone's aware, cows burp methane. That's a real thing, and it's significant. And methane, there's been a lot of talk about methane over the last couple weeks. There was that global agreement to try to reduce methane emissions. Methane is this really powerful greenhouse gas, much more powerful in the short term than carbon dioxide. So if you can reduce methane emissions, and if you can reduce the number of cows, burping away on the planet, that would have a genuine impact.
Given the many troubling observations you've written about over the years, how do you avoid deep depression? What factors allow you to continue exploring these areas as dark as they are?
Well, I don't want to claim to have avoided deep depression. The world is a really interesting place. One of the great things about being a journalist, which never gets old, even if the material is very depressing, is you're always learning something. So whenever I go out and write a new story, I'm learning something, and often I'm going somewhere new or meeting new people, and so it's very interesting, even if it's ultimately dispiriting. How's that? I guess that sheer curiosity maybe keeps me going.
Sounds good. Which countries seem to be the most sympathetic to global warming?
You mean sort of doing the most to actually?
Yes.
Yeah, well, it's really always been the Northern Europeans. They've really led the charge. They led the charge, way back in the 90s for the Kyoto Protocol. The EU has always sort of been the moving force, and the countries that have really, there are days when the Danes and the Germans, let's say, are mostly powering themselves with wind power, because they put a lot of effort into that. So I think they probably deserve the highest
Most
mark.
credit. Was there any discussion in Glasgow on plastics?
That's a good question. As you can tell, since I'm sitting here in Massachusetts, I am not in Glasgow, so I cannot, tell you. I'm sure there were sessions looking at plastics in part because plastic manufacturing, plastics are manufactured from fossil fuels, and so I suspect that they were addressed in one way or the other, but I can't answer that question very in any detail. Sorry.
All right. Here's one that we probably all want to know. Are there any steps individuals can take that have an impact, even if it's small? What can we do as individuals and communities?
Yeah, there are absolutely steps that individuals can take, and there are certainly steps that communities can take. It does once again get back to, as I said, those three sort of big baskets of emissions globally are also sort of the three baskets of emissions that we all participate in. Our power use, where you're getting your power, can you put up solar panels? Can you purchase? Most people now, I think, I strongly suspect in Connecticut, and you could, buy green energy. It costs a bit more usually, but you are then helping to fund this energy transformation, push it along. We should all be thinking about, how we get around, what kind of a car are you driving? Do you need to make that trip? All those things are, do you need to, flying is very carbon intensive activity. Eating meat. So those are things that, if everyone put up solar panels and, ate much less beef and flew much less, those would have really serious impacts. Now, on a community level, you might have read, there was just a story, I think it was in the Washington Post, about how Ithaca, the city of Ithaca, has decided to try to electrify the whole city. They're going to, not going to have any more, gas stoves or oil heating, and they have a municipal utility, and they're going to try to, produce only clean electricity. So that would be sort of a model community. And I think I would encourage anyone who's interested to look into that. And I think we need more of those model communities to show how it could be done, how we could make this transition.
Since oil and gas companies play such a huge part in our carbon footprint, what will they be able to do or produce to get away from oil and gas?
Well, that's a really good question. And that is part of this, unfortunately, fight to the death, why fossil fuel companies are identified, and correctly, as a major barrier to action. Because, if you're Exxon, if you're Shell, most of your worth is tied up in the value of these oil fields that you own. And if you can't pump that oil, people talk about the carbon bubble, stranded assets, things that have been valued at billions of dollars that should on some level be worthless. So that's a really big question. And if I worked for a fossil fuel company, I think they should be thinking very, very, and some of them are more forward-looking than others, about, let's just say, diversifying, getting into different forms of energy. But you are always going to have that problem that they have assets on their books that they should, in a world where we were not burning fossil fuels, simply have to write off, and they're very, very reluctant to do that.
Is there carbon capture? Are there carbon capture facilities in the United States?
There are always going to be. There are some little pilot projects, but I don't know of any serious ones. And I should say, there are two kinds of carbon capture. There's capturing carbon at a power plant. That's one kind of carbon capture. And then there's capturing carbon out of just directly out of the air. And I think there are probably all sorts of little pilot projects, like some of those companies that I talked about. Those are in the US. They're trying to capture CO2 directly out of the air, but they're very, very small scale at this point.
Well, I want to thank you so much for bringing this book to us today, and for hosting the book club a couple of weeks ago. I'll just hold it up again for everyone to see. And as I said, our partners at Barrett Bookstore have all of Elizabeth's books on the shelf, and you couldn't ask for more interesting and sobering books to read, but it's important information. So thank you for bringing it to us tonight, and thank you for that wonderful slideshow.
Thank you all. Thanks for coming. Thanks for reading. Thanks for having me.
All right. Good night from the Darien Library. Good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone.